Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Fun and Games Podcast. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I'm Matt, a.k.a. Stormageddon.
And today we wanted to talk about, well, I wouldn't call it a hot button or anything, but it is sort of a mainstay of the industry that people wonder about, and that's remakes.
Yeah, there seems to be, after every so many years, they take something that existed previously and redo it from a wide variety of ways, from Xbox Live's famous up-resing of graphics and kind of re-releasing the same game but with prettier graphics but not much change, to the completely overhauled games that get a completely new design and control scheme and everything, to even stuff like the long-awaited and highly hyped Final Fantasy VII Remake, which is supposed to come out for the PS4, but we're still limited on information. The newest thing is that it may be episodic, and so we have to actually buy multiple discs of it, and so on and so forth. And I think it's just important to talk about and kind of acknowledge how remakes can both help and fail the industry a little bit.
Absolutely. And yes, on the Final Fantasy VII point, to be fair, Final Fantasy 15 was supposed to be on the PS3. So
yeah, that's true.
Know what's going to happen there. Well, it's interesting because you can have a lot of different opinions on what a remake does for a system, for a company, for a franchise, depending upon why it's being remade and to what purpose. Because you have to look at a remake's release and its circumstances and ask yourself why. In the case of Final Fantasy VII, it is largely to appeal to a long-running fan demand. And that's a perfectly valid reason, and I'm glad that they're doing it the way that they're doing, from the ground up, full remake. They're not just... I mean, they already re-released Final Fantasy VII on Steam, on PS4, through the network, not just a ROM of the original, but an updated version. Not terribly updated, just a couple little bells and whistles. They smoothed out a few graphics, but it's closer to a re-release than a remake.
Yeah, I think that brings us to an interesting question about remakes, which you had actually posed to me a while back, and that's when you're working on a remake, do you want to do it true to the original, or do you want to make changes? Because that's where I kind of stand with Final Fantasy and some other remakes, is that if I'm going to play the same exact story all over again on a much later version of it, something that's several generations later as far as consoles go, I want it to be a different experience. The story can be the same. I don't even expect a ton of change to that necessarily, but I want the mechanics and the moves to change. I don't want just prettier graphics, because if it's still, especially with Final Fantasy VII, I feel like if they just re-release another time-based RPG with materia, it's going to get boring because we know the story, and if the mechanics haven't changed, there's less interactivity for it.
Yeah, you're more flexing an old muscle than enjoying a new experience. And Final Fantasy's kind of a funny franchise to look at because they have a long and storied history of remaking previous entries.
Yeah.
The one that I find very interesting and a very good example of the different kind of attack points on the concept of a remake is Final Fantasy Origins for the PS1. That is around the time, if I'm remembering correctly, that the first big remake they did came out. It was Final Fantasy 1 and 2 released on a single disc, and it wasn't just the ROMs of the NES versions dumped on with a little emulator program and the software to boot it up for you, which a lot of things do. Essentially that's what the virtual console is, which is why it's, right up there. But it's an interesting thing because Final Fantasy, just saying the name alone conjures up a lot of memories for people. It has a touchstone for a great many gamers.
Yeah.
But everybody it's like Doctor Who. Everyone has their first Doctor and their favorite Doctor. They may not necessarily be the same. They typically are. And everyone has their first Final Fantasy and their favorite Final Fantasy, and you can argue about them ad nauseum. And the original Final Fantasy was my first Final Fantasy. Played it on the NES. I had the box, I had the instructions, I had all the stuff. This wasn't a nostalgia trip. It was the trip. And it was a wonderful, amazing thing. It was the beginning of a lifelong love affair. As of this moment, I still love Final Fantasy. But when you go back and play it, even as they spruce up the bells and whistles, even as they've cleaned up gameplay, they've kept a lot of it intact. And even with the conveniences they put in, it shows how far gameplay and expectations of design and time and everything else has evolved. You sit there and everyone, sort of the common buzzword, whatever, a throw around review of Final Fantasy. It's good, but it's a grind fest.
Yeah.
That's what it was. Too many a lot of random battles, a lot of you had to level up in order to do this. And yeah, you run into that, especially if you're used to, at the time, Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy VIII. And then you go back to Final Fantasy, and it's like, oh, cool. Oh, man, they updated the graphics. Oh, the music sounds pretty good. But you run into it's that little bit of a rock and a hard place. But also, it was very interesting because it was remade from the ground up. It utilized the system well. It was not the only remake that Final Fantasy released for the PS1. They also released Final Fantasy Anthologies and Final Fantasy Chronicles, which when you take it all together, they released Final Fantasy 4, 5, 6, and Chrono Trigger, all on the PS1, all on disc with, a couple little, bells and whistles. However, because in that case, they just used an emulator, there were greater loading times. Almost painful loading times.
Yeah.
Final Fantasy Origins still had a disc-based loading time to it, but it wasn't necessarily as noticeable. So this is why it's a very interesting nut to crack as far as the concept of remakes go and looking at a couple of jumping off points.
Well, it's funny because you bring up Chrono Trigger, and that is my first RPG experience, and I've mentioned that on the show before. But also, that re-release was not a remake. They added content to it, some never before played dungeons and some other stuff, and they added anime cutscenes. But for all intents and purposes, it was just a re-release. It wasn't remade. They didn't redefine the wheel. And for that game, I found that I liked that more because I'm not worried about. That's a game that I'm content to play over and over again the same way. I'm not looking for a changed experience because I think there are aspects to that engine, the text and the cross text and all of that stuff that stays innovative and fun no matter how many times you play it. And of course, the ridiculous amount of endings doesn't hurt either.
True enough.
Whereas, something like Final Fantasy and that re-release and the changes they made scratches a different itch. I think that, and speaking of recent remakes, right at the end of the Xbox 360's life cycle, they released a reimagining, if you will, of the DuckTales game for Nintendo.
Yes.
I only played the demo. I didn't get to actually play the full game, but from what I saw, it was this improved music, updated graphics.
Yes.
But the gameplay pretty much stayed the same. I think they added a few little bells and whistles, but all in all, the mechanics stayed the same.
Yeah, they added some voiceover from the cast from the original show.
Yeah. And so, I feel like with that, that's a great example of a game that was so strong when it came out and kind of backing up my Chrono Trigger discussion. Although that feels more like a remake because they added new things. They added the voiceover. They added some extra levels. They added some new items and stuff like that. But the gameplay was so strong in the original game that there was no reason to change it.
Absolutely. And they didn't add any new mechanics per se. They didn't update it because of a sequel or anything like that. Granted, there was a DuckTales sequel, but they didn't change any of the fundamentals of gameplay because of it.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And it's interesting to me with remakes also because, we're a gaming podcast, but it's no secret that the movies and TV do this constantly as well. And I find that with me, for movies that are remade, the ones that stand out the most are the ones that kind of do their own take on it. They don't just try and repurpose and retread the original. Same for covers, which are essentially, you could argue, are remakes of songs.
Yes.
I also tend to gravitate towards the ones that make a song their own,
Yes.
with a little nod to the original version.
Yeah, that they are more in the style of those that are covering it rather than the original.
Yeah. But again, with remakes too, it's so popular to do now because if you're, for example, say you're Capcom and you know that you're riding high on Street Fighter 5 and 6 and that people are falling in love again with your franchise.
Mm-hmm.
But the definitive version of your game that's always talked about is Street Fighter. Well, Nintendo and Capcom partnered up to do something that was interesting because they're re-releasing an ultra version of Super Street Fighter 2 that they're adding online play, they're adding new characters, but the core gameplay they're keeping the same. They're updating the graphics. They're adding some game mechanics, but more or less, they're keeping the game the same, and you can even play the original version of it and down-res the graphics.
Yes, and Street Fighter is another interesting nut. I'm going to move away from the nut terminology. But
what do you think we are, squirrels?
I don't know. We're nuts. But anyway. But Street Fighter 2 is another deep thing to unpack because even before we came into before the notion of an HD re-release was even thought of, before there was HD, when there was only the D, before there was the D. The fact is, Street Fighter 2 was re-released in so many different versions that you could it was already its own kind of running joke when you had Super Street Fighter 2, Street Fighter 2 Turbo, Hyper Street Fighter 2 Championship Edition, Super Hyper Street Fighter, and then it just sort of becomes elongated, and every time it brought with it tweaks to gameplay, additional pieces. This was what you had to do before DLC could happen. So, Capcom is DLC hipsters. They did it first.
Essentially. I mean, but you also have to admit that it's interesting that with a game like Street Fighter, that they continue to re-release that one version, even though there have been so many other games, sequels and other series and all of that, and that the fans go with them. I mean, I think Super Street Fighter 2 is still the definitive competition game, and I think Street Fighter. I think the newer Street Fighters might have replaced it in some circles, but those are still considered the definitive versions, and I think that adds a lot of weight to a remake too. The audience has to want it. I think if you try and remake something that was popular but nobody seems to be really interested in a remake, it could fall flat. Or even, for example, there are spiritual remakes that have become a thing in the Indiegogo era and the GoFundMe era
and the Kickstarter.
Kickstarter era, with games. What was the game that was by the original creator of Mega Man?
Mighty Number 9.
Mighty Number 9, where it got funded. So many people were excited for it. It was going to be another Mega Man-esque game, and then it came out and absolutely crashed and burned because it was too repetitive, too many glitches. It didn't do enough new things, and what the creators thought the fans wanted was the same experience again, and that's not the case. They wanted the same experience, but updated and modernized.
And they took some modern elements and put them in a very clumsy way. There was characters and conversation and story and voiceover, but it was at the cost of pace and fun. When you had to constantly stop for these things or listen to them over and over again, it got very grating. It sucked the fun out.
Yeah.
In addition to all the things you said before.
Yeah. Well, I think, when dealing with remakes, you have to tread carefully because, like I was saying before with my expectations of Final Fantasy VII, and I have friends who have fought against me on it, but I want a new combat system. I would love to still have materia because I feel like materia is core to the story of Final Fantasy, but I would love either new ways to combine materia or, definitely a new battle system, all of these things that would make the experience feel new again.
Yes.
I'm a fan of re-releases, I think, more than... I think I'm a fan of re-releases if it's been long enough, but when you re-release a game that came... Like the new thing now where they're re-releasing games from the previous generation...
Mm-hmm.
You're starting to run into, I think, the same thing we're seeing in movies with fatigue. If you're upgrading the graphics and you're keeping the game the same, then it's essentially a port. I guess that's different, but in a positive, I would say, and this is more re-release than remake, is the Uncharted collection. I never had a PS3, so I got the Uncharted collection on the PS4. And it was great to get to play these games I've never played. And this is a case of I get to enjoy these up-res graphics and improved sound design just because I never got to experience before. So I don't know that I'm getting something better because I know what it was previously. I just know I'm getting something better because of what's marketed and that it's been updated.
And you're getting your first experience with it, which is the other side of it where it needs to, you said it needs to be something new. And in a lot of cases, a lot of previous games that are re-released either as a collection or something else, what I find it not necessarily be the most successful, but certainly the most appealing to me is when you have a game from a previous generation that is now released on a handheld. Like,
Yeah.
my first full Chrono Trigger experience was Chrono Trigger DS, which really doesn't change much. It changes nothing. It only adds a few things, a few pieces to the original Chrono Trigger experience. A little bit of touch control and a few dungeon pieces. And those same anime cutscenes from the PS1. So it's not as if it took away from the experience. It's not as if it ruined anything, but it meant I could game on the go. And the same as the Ultra Street Fighter 2 collection that is happening on the Switch, it is also if you're going to play Super Street Fighter, if that's your tournament game, this isn't going to convince you. But if you want to play some Street Fighter on the go, on your console, whatever, this can appeal to you. I'm currently playing the demo for Disgaea 5 complete for the Switch because between the last podcast and this one, my household now has a Switch. Yay!
All right.
Hooray! But so I'm currently playing through that demo, and Disgaea is a series that I played the original, and I didn't even finish the original on PS2, Disgaea Hour of Darkness, but I enjoyed it. And this is an opportunity to kind of get back into it. I didn't get a PS3, so I didn't follow a lot of it. And so I was like, all right, well, this is my way of experiencing it. The fatigue comes in when people feel as though they have to keep up with every single iteration, which, yeah, if you're going to do that, that's going to be tiring. And I agree with you. I'm going to switch gears slightly here. I agree with you on the fact that the game should change if they're remaking it. Back to the Final Fantasy VII idea. If you can't change a little bit and expect it all to work. You need to kind of kill your darlings here. As we've said in previous episodes, because this is feeling like an early thesis for us. If they remake Final Fantasy VII, they can do whatever they want to it, and you can still play the original. It doesn't delete it. It doesn't get rid of it. If all you have is a PS4 now, or you don't want to buy the Steam version, or you don't want to buy that original version, that's up to you. And if it was the fact that you couldn't play Final Fantasy VII any other way on the PS4, that would also be a little different, because people don't necessarily hold on to their old systems as much as sometimes they wish they could, or others do. And you have to take into account that every release of a game, whether it is a port, a re-release, a remake, a reimagining, a reconceptualizing, whatever, may be the first experience that a gamer of any stripe has with that franchise, with that entry, with that game. And sometimes it's really fun to look at a series that in the middle of its numberings, the third release, the fourth release, the whatever, it suddenly gains a huge spike in popularity. This causes people to go, well, what about this is number 4. What about the first 3? This is a good time to re-release those games. Now, people that have had their first experience with the 4th version, going back to the 3rd version, it may be really similar, but it's going to feel clunky. You're going to have that Final Fantasy 1 experience when 7 was your first one. And that's going to be really frustrating. But if all it takes is a little bit of cleaning up of the engine, a couple of changes, you're not going to ruin the original release of it. However, this version can go for people who want to delve back and re-experience the story. It's great for RPGs.
I think what you bring up also that's interesting to me, that comment about it's not going to erase the original, is something you run into a lot with the I'm going to say angry fanboys. And if you're an angry fanboy and you want to write me hate mail, go for it.
Please.
But it tends to be angry fanboys. When we were dealing with the Ghostbusters remake, reboot, whatever you want to call it, people were complaining that it's going to ruin things or it's going to be terrible.
Yes.
So what? And I didn't see the new Ghostbusters yet, and I will. But my logic is, well, if it's terrible, okay, great, it's terrible. It doesn't change the fact that you have the original movie, so I don't understand what your problem is. And it's the same with games that are remade. A lot of people are complaining about Final Fantasy VII getting remade because it'll ruin the experience. And I'm like, it's not, though, because you can still play the original game, like you said. It doesn't erase it from time.
It doesn't patch over the original. Even if you have Final Fantasy VII for the PS4, the Steam release, I I mean, I highly doubt this. This may happen. I highly doubt that if you get the first episode of Final Fantasy VII, Sector 6 bomb run, that it's going to erase or patch that over or anything else. So you can still, compare the two. I don't know. There's something really fun about that. I enjoy when releases can kind of cross over a little bit and you can enjoy them differently because things have changed a little bit. Another remake that I kind of enjoy and is one that kind of hits a lot of the points we've been talking about is Metal Gear Solid: The Twin Snakes.
Yes.
The remake of the original Metal Gear Solid for the GameCube. It was done in a partnership with Nintendo and Silicon Knights. Now, you have a game that is strongly associated with PlayStation. With the PlayStation console down the line, Metal Gear Solid 4 is still a PS3 exclusive. Metal Gear Solid, PS1, this is what it is. So for it to go to Nintendo is interesting. For it to be made by a different company, these are interesting things. And Metal Gear Solid 2, Sons of Liberty had already been released. And so with that came some updates to the gameplay. And they didn't quite alter the difficulty or alter the layout too much, but also added in other facets of gameplay that were designed around Metal Gear Solid 2. You could now aim and fire in first-person view. You could now have a tranquilizer gun. You could now grip and sidle along ledges. These are all simple, small things that have large effects on how you traverse the environment because Metal Gear Solid was a game about how you traverse your environment and tackle the challenges ahead of you, whether next-generation soldiers or just the environment itself. So this then made it a much easier game. And you could argue about whether or not that's a good thing. But they also then took the cutscenes and they pushed the ridiculousness in a series that is already Metal Gear Solid. They shoved it over the top. When you've got when what was once a simple guns-drawn standoff is now Snake disarming somebody in a very John Woo style way. In what was once running off from a huge explosion is now Snake literally riding a missile and kick-flipping it back at a helicopter. And I love that. They are two different wonderful experiences that I am happy having cohabitating in my home. And there's a very interesting sort of headcanon about the whole thing in that Metal Gear Solid for the PS1 is the incident, the Shadow Moses Island incident, as it actually happened. Whereas the Twin Snakes version is actually the Hollywood version because it was brought up in the lore of Metal Gear Solid 2 that one of the support team, one of the members of the support team, Nastasha Romanenkov, wrote a expose about the whole thing. And so it was argued that the Twin Snakes is actually the film based on the book, based on the game. And listen, if that is your absolutely absurd explanation for an even more absurd game, power to you. Thank you.
Right.
And I still play the original, and everything that happened in the Twin Snakes still doesn't affect me. If I want to play that, I can pop that in.
Yeah. I think that also talking about remakes, we could talk about games that they've remade all till the end of time. I remember the most disappointing re-release remake that I bought was Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles: Turtles in Time Reshelled.
Yes.
And that was an example of a game that got beautifully updated graphics, but because the gameplay more or less stayed the same, and some of it was even slowed down, so the attacks weren't as fast, you couldn't throw the same way you used to, all of this stuff, it made it a drag to play and had almost no replay value. And I know they wanted to kind of update it for a new generation, but I just feel like they dropped the ball on the mechanics because they could have added more super moves, added additional characters. They could have done so much simple adjustment to it to make it more engaging and add replay value, and they didn't bother, and that's where it really hurt a game like that because it didn't have innovative controls to begin with. So to not make updates left modern gamers kind of bored.
And it was clear that they made an attempt to upscale it, and yet they fell short.
Yeah.
But on the flip side, one that we were talking about before recording this episode, the Disney Afternoon Collection.
Yes.
Which I just recently got, And I'm going to say it again, I am currently losing my mind over it. Because, and this is an interesting one because it is a collection, and they didn't change a thing about how the gameplay works. I know this. I have the Lost Lives to prove it. And it's a very interesting one because it is a mix of well-loved common games from the NES era and a couple of obscure ones, yet still within the same franchise, because both DuckTales and Chip 'n Dale Rescue Rangers, games that I owned in cartridge form when I was a child, and I still own some now.
Me too.
They had sequels that were far and away improvements. They cleaned up the controls. They added some cool elements to it. And yet never lost the spirit of the games. But they were released after the Super NES had come out, and much like a lot of console generations, things that were released in their waning time or when their successor already came out, limited production numbers, limited push, limited appeal, and so they kind of enter a mythical status. So this is not only a chance to recapture a youthful ideal or nostalgia or something to show your friends or just something to enjoy. It also allows you to gain easy access to a game that you might have never tried or had when you were a kid. You don't have your old games anymore for one reason or another, and it is so prohibitively expensive to get them again. And that's one reason why I enjoy re-releases in a lot of cases. I bought a PS TV before I had any other PS Vita, PS4, whatever, because it allowed me for a very small price to have access to a network that let me get very obscure PS1 games for a very low price. It allowed me, if you take into account the cost of the PS TV, the PS3 controller that I bought, and the cost of games, that costs less than it would cost for me to purchase even one of the games I'm thinking of. I now have Suikoden 2. I now have The Adventures of Miss Tronbon. I have Tomba 1 and 2.
Wow.
If you, again, I got them on sale. Even if I'd bought them at the full price on the PSN store, it would not have been much. But I spent less than $10 and I have those 4 games plus some others. But those are 4 big ones that are I mean, the Tomba games aren't as hot ticket of items as the first 2. However, the combined total of those, if you were to check, eBay or the shopping tab on Google right now, I would not be surprised if the cumulative of that was easily over $300.
Yeah, that wouldn't surprise me either.
Now, do you want to collect them? You can. But do you want to play them? Here's how.
Well, yeah, it's funny. That reminds me of something that actually, as of when we're recording this, the recent news, Nintendo announced for the Switch their online program. Because as we discussed in our Switch episode, their online and friends list leaves something to be desired at the moment. But
yes.
They did announce that they are releasing an online program, which is the cheapest yearly program of any of them, only $20.
Yeah.
But the really big news, so it has online gameplay and chat and an app for your smart device to chat with people and so on and so forth. All interesting stuff. But the real thing that's related to this that I find really fascinating is they're going to give you access to a library of older Nintendo games that you can play online. And the examples they gave in the news release, the press release, was Dr. Mario and Mario Brothers 3, just to name a few.
And Balloon Fight.
Oh, and Balloon Fight. And these
Yes.
are all games that I would love to be able to play online, especially Dr. Mario, which I loved. But even Super Mario Brothers, a game that I so associate with passing the controller, and hopefully you can still kind of do that if you're playing locally.
Oh, yeah.
But the fact that you could take it online is great. And that's not a remake by any means. It's just a re-release with one change.
It's almost, in a sense, when you do those sort of ports, those sort of things, it's almost a re-access.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. Just the same as the PSN examples I gave, those you pay into. But it almost feels like a Netflix for Nintendo games.
Yeah, that's what it really sounds like. And what's also interesting, though, and this leads me to some other questions, going back to Nintendo specifically, because this is something they tend to do more than other companies. A loose definition of a remake is a game that has a similar story to a previous version with either similar or completely changed game mechanics. If that's the case, and my definition is a little simplistic, I know it's more than that, but if that's the case, is every Mario game a remake? Is every Zelda game a remake? Especially thinking like Zelda Link to the Past and Zelda Link Between Worlds. Those are 2 games that aesthetically look very similar, play very similar, but they're considered separate games, not remakes. Why?
Well, that's also stretching the concept of a sequel.
Right. Because technically they're not sequels. They take place in the same world, but at very different times. But also think about Mario. Like the first 3 Mario games, U.S. release Mario game. Well, actually 1 and 3. Let's focus on 1 and 3. They're virtually identical. New power-ups, different enemies. But for the most part, gameplay is identical. With new power-ups adding a little bit of new gameplay. But those aren't considered remakes. They're considered brand new and separate games.
Yes, it is an interesting thing to look at. I guess it's if the title is the same.
Yeah.
Or if it's what you call a remake. I mean, Mega Man 3 is not a remake of Mega Man 2.
No.
It contains many continuity nods in the Doc Robots, and it's a continuation of the story, but it is a sequel. And I think a big thing with remakes is if it's between different systems. A bigger argument would be if Super Mario World was a remake of Super Mario Brothers. It's not. Super Mario All-Stars is.
Right. And see, that's a game where Super Mario All-Stars, it up-resed the graphics and updated the soundtrack a bit. But beyond that, it was the same game.
But it did have a save feature, which I find very nice.
Yes.
And I have a fun anecdote about that game. Because, if you have fun and games bingo going, I'm now mentioning my wife, hopefully that gives you a cross there.
Right.
When Sarah and I first combined our games and everything else, and the Wii that we had gotten was used. We bought it from a friend, and he had a couple of virtual console games on it, and included Super Mario Brothers 3. And again, the virtual consoles being able to just basically save state where you are is another one of those. We live a different life now. We don't.
Yeah.
We can't exactly reset from the beginning all the time. There are still games that allow that, but that isn't the norm anymore. So again, that's another one of those nice, thank you. It's a good update. I actually don't bemoan it. If you want to reset every time you die, nothing's stopping you. It's just an extra step. And if you want to start from the beginning anyway, you clearly enjoy extra steps.
Yeah.
Anyway, so we decided for whatever anniversary was the next one that we were going to play every level of Super Mario Brothers 3 together because we both loved that game when we were kids. And we sat down, we started playing it, and Sarah was a little weirded out because, and I couldn't figure out why. She's like, really? Did they do anything to the game? No, this is the original. This is Mario Brothers 3. It's Mario Brothers 3. It was the NES release, everything else. And given how I led into this, you might see where this is going. I eventually figured out that the only version of Mario Brothers 3 that Sarah had ever played was the All-Stars version. She didn't have an NES growing up. She had a Super NES, and she played the ever-loving bejesus out of it, and it had Mario All-Stars. So she played the original Mario games, but she never played them in the original NES version. She doesn't look down on those NES versions, and we certainly beat all those levels and had a great time. It was a wonderful anniversary. But that still allowed for that experience. And it's such a funny thing that I look at that as a wonderful example of you can remake a game. It's fine. It doesn't ruin the original, and it makes a new experience. And it's kind of fun to be able to compare notes as which one was your first and what do you experience and what do you like and don't like and what do they change and not change. And it's nice with Mario All-Stars because you're right, all they did was change the graphics and sound. They didn't have to do anything to the gameplay. It was fine. It's Mario. You don't need to change the gameplay.
Yeah. An argument to the other side of how remakes sometimes changes aren't for the better is I have experienced that with Conker's Bad Fur Day. I never had it on the N64, though I had an N64. But when I got a 360, even though I never owned an Xbox, the 360 allowed you to play backwards compatible a Conker Live and Reloaded, which came out on the 360. And one of the interesting things about that is that they put a lot of update and improvement into the multiplayer of the original, which I didn't really like. But the game itself, the single player, they actually downgraded. They changed some of the sounds. They edited out the cursing. They changed the soundtrack for certain stuff. And I always thought that was a curious choice. I mean, it was back at a time when they were really focusing on their online community development, but
yeah,
it was a bummer for the curses to be taken out. I mean, not that I have a problem with things being edited. That, it happens and that's fine. It was more for me in my personal experience. That's what gave that filthy game its charm. Once you edit out the curses, it kind of takes away the punch of that game.
Yeah, and it was a game that was built around that punch.
Right.
So, yeah, and you're right. That is probably the biggest deficit to remakes and re-releases and re-accessings. Because if it is a poor one, and this is somebody's first impression of that game, we've been talking about all of the positives. But if it is a bad entry for new people, that can be a shame. It doesn't ruin it. We're talking about it like old fogies. It doesn't ruin it for us. It ruins it for the next gen. It ruins it for the next people. If you are playing even something as simple as a device that allows you to re-access it, like the Game Boy player for GameCube, if we want to go back a little ways, it works. It's actually kind of infamously a little laggy, a little not fantastic. And if that's your first entry into it, well, you're not going to feel too charitable about it, or you might not even believe somebody's recommendations later. In our very first episode, I enthusiastically declared my favorite NES game to be Crystalis. They made a Game Boy Color port remake of that game, and it is abysmal. In addition to the fact that they had to downgrade the resolution, and that makes things a lot tighter, the hit detection is a great deal different. And that is a game that is very quick about its hit detection, both attacking and defending. And I was able to compare them side by side, and it infuriated me how off it was. And it was that sort of uncanny valley style. This is off, and I'm like disturbed deeper than I thought I could be about this. And the elements they tried to add and work with story felt very flat. If this was my first experience with what is one of my favorite games, I'd have never tried the NES version. And that's what's at stake, really.
Yeah.
Not us, the new people, the new blood. And if you don't want new blood, then pray for it to suck.
Right. Exactly. You're right, and I think what a fun way to be would to because we're talking about being old fogies and reminiscing and talking about it from that perspective, because that's the perspective we have. If you're listening and you're a younger gamer and want to talk about your first experience with a remake that you had not had previous experience with, please email us at funandgamespod@gmail.com or post on the site or on our Facebook page, because we'd love to hear those stories. But I think a fun exercise for me and Geoff at the end here, and I hadn't brought this up in advance, but it occurred to me, is maybe talking about a game we wish they'd remake that they haven't, and that at this point at least there's no intent of remaking. And I'll go first because it's a game that when I first experienced it, I really loved it. And I don't even know how you would remake it and make it better because it was so tight. But I think this would call for maybe a remake, re-release with updated graphics and stuff. Unfortunately, because the company's become kind of a joke lately, I don't know that it'll actually happen. But I yearn for a Banjo and Kazooie remake. I loved the original. They've re-released it before on Xbox 360, and that version is pretty much identical to the GameCube version. But I would love a remake of that because, I love that game very much, and to add more to it would be great because it's already an insane collectathon with a ton of stuff to do, and I would just love a bigger, badder version of it. And
you want that and not ukulele,
right? I mean, I'm gonna get ukulele when it comes out on the Switch. I'm very interested, but Banjo-Kazooie is a game where I want that story again with other cool stuff, sort of like what they're doing in Final Fantasy. I want to play that story again because it was cute and it was fun and I enjoy those characters, and I just want new mechanics, interesting new transformations, more stages, other things to collect. I think that would be a lot of fun.
Huh. I agree. And it would be one that nowadays we're not exactly in an environment that is as amenable to the 3D collectathon as it was, back in 2000. So it'd be interesting to see what should be and could be done to keep the spirit of it while not hanging too hard on the window dressing.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Now you put me on the spot here. I've got a lot of what about this? I'm almost like thinking about my collection and going, what would I want to see a newer version of? like something that I've played a lot that I'm really into. All right, let me think. You know one franchise that hasn't gotten any love in a long time? Adventure Island.
Yes. I love
I want to
Adventure
see a
Island.
fat man on dinosaurs.
I did love Adventure Island and games of the like your Joe and Mac and those kinds of side-scrolling adventure games. Those are always a lot of fun, and I feel like those have kind of died off a bit. I mean, we are getting Sonic Mania in August, which is going to be a brand new side-scrolling Sonic game with just Sonic, Tails, and Knuckles. So I'm very excited about that. But
and they follow the Capcom route with certain things and bringing in like fan creators that have vetted themselves in a sense in working on this. So, fingers crossed.
But I think that would be really cool because I would be interested to see, because not talking about Sonic Mania, they're going back to an old formula and not looking to really change it that much. Whereas with Adventure Island, those games were pretty fun already and pretty straightforward. So I'd be curious to see how you reinvent the wheel with a side scroller, because a lot of side scrollers that have come out, your new Super Mario Brothers and the like, tend to go back to the original formula with a few different power-ups and stuff like the giant mushroom in New Super Mario Brothers. But I'd be curious to see how they add stuff to Adventure Island to make it more engaging and different. Also adding a narrative to that would be really cool, because that's like Mario had a very basic narrative in those old days. So I'd be really curious to see what they did with that.
Well, what's interesting about it is they released 4 of them for the NES. I think the 4th one never made it to America. But they actually pushed the envelope every time. The first one did not have any dinosaur companions. It was just level to level to level. The second one, they added in, the animal friends. You could, save them for later use. You had a little bit of a rudimentary inventory system. And by the time the 4th one was rolling around, there was a little bit of a hub world. And I think if they went the route of something like Donkey Kong Country Returns, which did a great job of maintaining the feel of old Donkey Kong Country. It's not about how it looks. It's not about the perspective necessarily, so long as you maintain the feel. But a lot of good YouTube videos that I've watched and people I've spoken with and everything else, something about Donkey Kong Country was its rhythm and its frantic pacing.
Yeah.
And it is actually an incredibly rhythmic game from top to bottom. And there's great energy to it. And Donkey Kong Country Returns brings that back. And I love Donkey Kong Country Returns. I love Tropical Freeze. So I think whether you want to do a pseudo 3D thing like that, or you just want to kind of up the design a little bit and do a new Super Mario Brothers style thing with something like Adventure Island. I actually wasn't going to say Adventure Island until the words came out of my mouth. I was thinking about other things. But the more I talk about this, the more I'm actually kind of passionate about this. I'm going to start a petition.
You should. Unfortunately, I think Hudson Soft went under, who were the publishers of that.
I'm pretty sure.
But somebody must own the rights at this point.
Or again, find the people who made that damn stuff, or find some fans. Let's start a Kickstarter. That apparently works.
Apparently. I mean, that's the one thing I've been hearing about Yooka-Laylee that makes me excited about it, is that's a game that's essentially is a remake in a way of Banjo-Kazooie with new characters.
And from what I've heard, for better or for worse.
Yeah, I think the response is, for the most part, positive if you're looking for the same experience. It hasn't really expanded on it that much, which is the only thing that I think makes my want and request a little different. But, getting the same gameplay that still feels fluid and fun at least puts it a step ahead of Mighty Number 9 and the like. And so that excites me.
Yes, very much so. On the same token, I'm very excited about Bloodstained: Ritual of the Night.
Yes, me too. I'm hoping that'll also come out for the Switch. I mean, I grew up playing Castlevania, and especially Symphony of the Night is obviously one of the most definitive versions of that. So to know that something like that will come out. And that said, the newer Castlevanias have not been terrible. The 3D ones I played, and they're not bad. They were okay, but they just didn't feel like Castlevania games. They felt like God of War games.
Yes.
It didn't have that feeling that like the 2D side-scrolling ones on the Game Boy Advance and the 3DS and the DS had. Those kept kind of the spirit alive, because I think that game, not every game makes a great and smooth transition to a different space. And this is a small aside, but like your Metroid games, I like the side scrollers, and I never really liked the Metroid Prime series, but those who liked it loved it because it was something fresh and new.
And they decided to do something very different with it.
Yeah, and though I didn't like it, it didn't mean it didn't work. It just wasn't my preference. But I feel like the Castlevania games, they thrive in 2D, and so yeah, I'm also excited about that game as well.
So, it all remains a crapshoot, but at the end of the day, I feel that it's necessary. It's good. You can't exactly treat it like a movie and remake it or anything like that. I like to think of these things more as books, where if, sure, some people will look down on you because you bought the Barnes and Noble version of the collection of Edgar Allan Poe. But if that's how you read his poems and stories, good. You're reading them. You're experiencing them, and now you can talk about them with people. If somebody never saw the book on your shelf, but you spoke of the things that you'd read and you spoke of them intelligently and well, that's what matters, the content you get. And so regardless of whether your first time playing Super Mario Brothers was on the NES, on the Super NES, on Super Mario Brothers Deluxe for the Game Boy Color, Super Mario Brothers re-release for the NES Classics line on the Game Boy Advance, whether it was the Virtual Console release, whether played on the Wii or the Wii U, whether it was an on, if you start going da-da-da-da-da-da, and everyone will start going with you.
Yeah. I agree. I think on the whole, remakes are good and healthy for the industry. I think that, while they're not for everybody, it is a great way to introduce younger gamers into newer games.
Yes.
And I appreciate that as someone who has a young nephew who is very into gaming and who this past weekend told me that his friends think I'm the coolest uncle because I play video games.
Yeah.
So, I'll take that. I don't get a lot of compliments, so I'll take that one.
That's a good one.
But that makes me really excited because that means that when these games are remade and re-released, he'll get to experience these games he may have never played before and might really, really like them. I mean, he loves Mario Kart 8 because it's essentially playing like the older school Mario Kart games, and it allows him to get into this game that's been around for a very long time.
Yeah, and you know what? Mario Kart 64 is still the one we play the most in this house, if only because that's Sarah's favorite. And tournaments are still going to be played on Super Smash Bros. Melee because wave dashing. But
right.
But I think we can all love it. And yeah, I had a similar experience. I remember talking with this was a couple years ago. It was a company that Sarah was working for. I was talking with the CEO's son, who was 10 years old at the time, and I don't remember how the topic came up, but he and I were talking about Ninja Gaiden for the NES because he had it on his Wii U Virtual Console, and he was having so much trouble with the final boss, and we got to commiserate over that. Nearly 20 years difference
awesome.
in age, and we got to share an experience of the same frustrating game, and it was as fresh to him at 10 as it was to me. That's what I love.
Yeah, that's definitely special. I think that as a whole, they're necessary, just like anything else. I think, yes, we want original IPs, and I think the original IPs are still really important for different reasons. But I think that as long as I think re-releases and remakes are better than the yearly, and we'll get into this another time, I think, but the yearly nonsense release. I'm referring to your Call of Duties, your Assassin's Creed, your, whatever, those games.
Honestly, those feel more like cash grabs to me than remakes and re-releases.
Right. They're a whole other set. And I think remakes are definitely more important. And especially with us having so much access now to just the internet in general, I think they're definitely just important for perpetuating and continuing to grow the gaming community.
Agreed. And also, given the huge state of the gaming industry right now, sometimes unique IPs are a little difficult to come by for reasons that we as consumers don't necessarily see. So sometimes you need to get those re-releases out so you get a new experience, or you can revisit an old one to get some capital going so maybe they can either buy that license or support something new. So it's it's not all shovelware.
No, that's for sure. Unless it's Shovel Knight, then maybe it's shovelware.
I want to buy Shovel Knight on every possible system.
I know your wife hates you for that.
Yes.
Thank you, everyone, as always, for listening to the Fun and Games podcast. We are, of course, on Facebook, Twitter. I share it on Tumblr. You can follow me at DJ Stormageddon on Tumblr. We have an email address, which is funandgamespod@gmail.com. We're pretty much everywhere you can think of on the internet.
You can find us.
Yeah, we're on iTunes, Google Play, TuneIn, and more. We always appreciate you listening. Please comment and share your gaming experience. We want to continue to grow a community of just gamers who love talking about gaming in general, and especially in a artistic and intelligent way. Not that we are above devolving into nonsense and finger pointing as well, because we're not. we're also hoping to start releasing merchandise soon. I'm working on a t-shirt store, a virtual t-shirt store, and I would like to start selling Fun and Games t-shirts. If that's something that you'd be interested in and interested in purchasing, please let us know either in an email, a comment, or on the website, because I would really like to create something that everyone can enjoy together.
Yes. Thank you so much once again for tuning in to another episode of Fun and Games Podcast. We hope to catch you on the next one. Once again, I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I am Matt, a.k.a. Stormageddon.
And happy gaming.